When the sea turned black and the ravens refused the sky, we knew the old gods were no longer watching. They were waiting. Hello! Get comfortable and adjust the volume. Today's story called The Ashen Crown of Skeld. Let's begin.
The fjord of Skeld had always been hard but never silent. That winter, even the waves seemed to hold their breath. Eirik Halvarsson, 32 winters old, stood on the black cliffs and watched smoke crawl from the ruins of his father's hall. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark blonde hair braided tight against the wind, his blue eyes fixed on the charred beams below. Jarl Halvar had died with a sword in hand, betrayed by men he had once called brothers. Eirik had not been there. That absence burned deeper than grief. The ravens circled low, restless, as if the air itself tasted wrong. In Skeld, men whispered that the gods had turned their faces away. Eirik did not believe the gods had left. He believed they were waiting for someone willing to answer.
The men who betrayed Halvar now feasted in the half-burned hall, claiming loyalty to a distant king across the sea. They said Skeld needed strength. Eirik knew what they meant: obedience. At 32, he had led raids to the west and returned with silver and scars. He was no stranger to blood. But this was different. This was rot inside the bone. He walked into the hall without a helmet, letting them see his face clearly in the firelight. Conversations died. The usurper, Ragnvald the Crooked, rose slowly. Ragnvald was 45, thick in the chest, heavy in the jaw, his graying brown hair tied back, dark eyes calculating. He smiled as if welcoming kin. Eirik saw the lie in it. Tonight would not be the night of vengeance. Tonight was for measuring enemies.
Among the shadows stood Astrid of the Deep Grove. She was 29, neither wife nor widow, a seeress who answered to no man. Her auburn hair fell to her waist, her green eyes steady and unafraid. She wore a fitted wool dress the color of storm water, leather cinched at her waist, silver rings circling her arms. The neckline revealed only a subtle curve, yet the firelight made her presence impossible to ignore. Astrid had warned Halvar of treachery. He had not listened. When her gaze met Eirik's, something passed between them. Not comfort, not desire, but recognition. She stepped forward and placed a small bone charm in his hand. "The sea is not finished with your blood," she said. Ragmald laughed, but unease rippled across the benches.
That night Eirik walked the shoreline alone. The charm Astrid had given him was carved with a crown split in two. He had heard old stories of the Ashen Crown, forged before kings claimed Norway, said to grant dominion over sea and flame. He had dismissed them as tales for winter. Now, with Skeld fractured, the legend returned like a blade drawn from snow. Astrid found him there. She did not soften her words. Ragnvald has sworn himself to a power older than the crown. Eirik studied her face, searching for doubt. There was none. The tide pulled at the rocks, steady and relentless. "Then we break that power," he said. Astrid's lips curved slightly. "Or it will break you first."
Astrid spoke of a cavern beneath the fjord cliffs, sealed by iron and rune. Ragnvald had sent men there weeks before Halvar's death. None returned unchanged. Some would not speak. Others screamed of fire beneath water. Eirik gathered 5 loyal warriors, all past 30, hardened and silent. Among them was Bjorn the Red, 38, thick-bearded and broad as an ox. They rode at dawn, cutting through mist that clung to the sea like damp wool. The entrance revealed itself at low tide, a jagged mouth in black stone. Eirik felt no fear, only a tightening certainty. If the Ashen Crown was real, it slept below. And if Ragnvald sought it, then Skeld's fate had already begun to turn.
Inside, the air was thick with salt and something metallic. Torches hissed against damp stone. Runes carved into the walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Astrid traced them with careful fingers. "These are older than our father's gods," she murmured. Eric's boots echoed on the stone floor until they reached a chamber where iron chains hung from the ceiling. At the center stood a stone altar split clean in half. Upon it rested a circlet of blackened metal, cracked yet whole. The ashen crown. Eric felt heat rise from it, though no flame touched it. Bjorn stepped forward, but Astrid raised her hand sharply. "It does not choose lightly." Eric stepped past them all. "Then let it judge me."
When his fingers closed around the crown, the world fractured. He stood in a vision of Skeld aflame, ships burning in the harbor, Ragnvald kneeling before a towering figure of smoke and ember. The figure had no face, only a hollow where eyes should be. It whispered in a language older than wind. Eric felt his own heart answer. The crown burned against his skin but did not consume him. Instead, it carved something into him, resolve sharpened beyond doubt. He tore himself from the vision and found Astrid gripping his arm, her green eyes wide yet steady. "You saw it," she said. Eric nodded once. "It wants a king." Bjorn spat on the ground. "Then let us give it one it cannot control."
They returned to Skeld before nightfall. Word spread quickly that Eric had entered the forbidden cavern and come back alive. Ragnvald summoned him at once. This time the hall was full. Shields lined the walls. Torches blazed brighter than before. Astrid stood at Eric's side openly now. Ragnvald's gaze lingered on the crown in Eric's hand. "You meddle with things beyond you," the older man warned. Eric's voice carried without strain. "You already did." Murmurs rippled across the warriors. Ragnvald's hand drifted toward his axe. The crown answers to strength. Eric stepped forward until they were a single breath apart. "Then let it witness ours."
Steel rang like thunder. The duel was swift and brutal. Ragnvald fought with heavy strength, each swing meant to break bone. Eric moved with colder precision. Years at sea had taught him balance against shifting ground. Sparks flew as blades met. The hall roared approval at every near strike. Astrid watched without flinching, her hands clasped around her staff. When Ragnvald overreached, rage blinding him, Eric stepped inside the arc and drove his sword beneath the ribs. Silence followed. Ragnvald's dark eyes widened, then dimmed. He fell hard against the wooden floor. Eric did not look triumphant. He looked resolved. "Skeld bends to no distant king," he declared. "We stand or fall by our own fire."
Ragnvald's death did not end the darkness. That night the sea turned unnaturally calm. No wind touched the water. Astrid felt it first, a pressure in her chest like a storm held back. The ember figure from Eric's vision was no mere spirit. It was bound to the crown, feeding on ambition and oath. By claiming the circlet, Eric had not destroyed the power. He had invited it closer. In the quiet of the hall, as warriors drank to a new jarl, Astrid pulled Eric aside. "It will test you," she warned. "Not with enemies, but with choices." Eric rested the crown upon the table. "Then we choose wisely. Outside, the ravens refuse to land."
Days later, ships appeared on the horizon, long narrow silhouettes against gray sky. The distant king had answered Ragnald's oath even in death. 20 vessels cut towards Skeld with disciplined speed. Eric stood at the prow of his own ship, the ashen crown secured at his belt. Bjorn commanded the left flank.
Astrid remained on shore to prepare runes in the sand. She was no battlefield ornament. She was a weapon shaped differently. As the enemy ships drew near, a low hum rolled across the water. The sea itself seemed to listen. Eric raised his sword. "Hold formation," he commanded. The first arrows darkened the sky. Skeld would either burn or be reborn before sunset.
The clash shattered the calm. Wood splintered. Men roared, axes bit deep. Eric fought at the front, his movements relentless. Yet amid the chaos, he sensed the ember presence stirring, feeding on fury. Flames leapt higher than they should when pitch ignited. Smoke twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that flickered and vanished. On shore, Astrid cut her palm and pressed blood into the carved runes. She stood straight, despite the wind tearing at her hair and dress. Her voice carried across the water in a chant older than memory. The sea responded with a sudden swell, lifting Skeld's ships just enough to break the enemy's rhythm. Eric seized the moment and drove forward.
As ships collided and men fell into freezing water, the ember figure rose briefly from the largest burning vessel, towering above mast and sail. Only Eric and Astrid seemed to truly see it, its hollow gaze fixed on the crown at Eric's side. Power surged through him, strength beyond muscle, clarity beyond rage. He could end this quickly by surrendering to that force, letting flame consume friend and foe alike. For a heartbeat, the temptation was pure and bright. Then he saw Bjorn dragging a wounded man to safety, saw warriors fighting not for glory, but for home. Eric chose restraint. He shouted for retreat and reformation, breaking the enemy's advance without feeding the fire.
By dusk, the invading fleet withdrew, shattered and smoking. Skeld still stood. Cheers echoed across the harbor, but Eric felt no triumph. The crown pulsed faintly at his hip, displeased. Astrid met him at the shoreline, her dress damp with seawater, her expression searching. "You denied it," she said quietly. He nodded. "It would have taken more than the enemy." Astrid's gaze softened for the first time. "Power without leash destroys the hand that holds it." He looked at her then, not as seeress, not as omen, but as woman. The firelight from the surviving ships traced the curve of her back and the silver at her waist. In that fragile calm, something steadier than battle began to grow.
Peace did not return easily. Rumors spread that the distant king would come himself. Skeld needed more than victory. It needed unity. Eric called an assembly of all free men and women above 25 winters. He placed the Ashen crown before them, but did not wear it. "This will not rule us," he declared. "We rule it." Debate lasted hours, voices rising and falling like tide. Astrid spoke last. She described the ember spirit as hunger shaped into will. "Bind it with oath," she urged, "not of one, but of many." The idea settled heavily yet firmly. Skeld would not kneel to a single throne, not even Eric's. They would forge something harder together.
Under Astrid's guidance, they carried the crown back to the cavern. This time, the entire council followed. Burun, shield maidens, farmers hardened by years of cold. Torches lit the path. The runes along the walls flared brighter as if resisting their approach. At the altar, Eric did not hesitate. He set the crown down and stepped back. One by one, each leader cut their palm and pressed blood to the cracked metal, swearing that Skeld's strength would never serve tyranny. The cavern shook as the ember presence writhed, starved of solitary ambition. Astrid's chant wove their voices into one. The crown's glow dimmed from fierce red to steady coal.
When the tremors ceased, silence returned, not the suffocating stillness from before, but a calm earned through struggle. The ember spirit no longer towered unseen. It flickered briefly above the crown, smaller, contained, then sank into the metal as into a cage. Eric exhaled slowly. The power had not vanished. It had changed shape. Astrid swayed, exhausted yet upright. He caught her before she fell, steadying her with careful strength. She met his eyes and allowed herself a rare smile. "Now it answers to will shared," she whispered. Outside, the tide began to rise again in natural rhythm, as if the sea itself approved the balance restored beneath stone and iron.
Seasons turned. The distant king never returned. Word of the failed invasion had spread faster than his pride. Skeld rebuilt its hall larger than before, beams carved with new runes of unity. Eric was named jarl by voice of the assembly, not by blood alone. He accepted with measured humility. The Ashen crown remained locked within the cavern, guarded not by chains, but by oath. Astrid walked freely between hall and grove, advisor and equal. Whispers of her beauty lingered, yet no man dared reduce her to ornament. She had faced fire and bound it. At 32 and 29, they stood not as legend yet, but as foundation for one.
Yet legends do not end with calm. Years later, travelers spoke of a southern warlord seeking relics of old power. Some urged Eric to hide the crown deeper. Others suggested destroying it. Astrid listened, then shook her head. "Power denied grows wild," she said. "Power understood stays bound." Eric agreed. The lesson of Skeld was not fear, but discipline. He often returned to the cliff where his father's hall once burned. The scar on his brow had faded, but not vanished. He understood now that leadership was not flame, but forge. It required heat enough to shape, and restraint enough not to melt everything into ash.
On the 10th anniversary of Halvar's death, Skeld gathered for remembrance. A pyre was lit not in mourning, but in honor. Astrid stood beside Eric, her auburn hair braided with silver threads, her green eyes reflecting firelight. Her dress, deep blue and fitted at the waist, left her shoulders strong and bare to the night air without immodesty. They spoke not of betrayal, but of choice. The moment when fire had offered easy dominion and been refused. The people listened closely. Children, now grown beyond 25 winters, heard the story as warning and promise alike. Skeld's strength lay not in crown or blade, but in the will to stand together against both enemy and temptation.
In time, bards carried the tale beyond the fjords. They sang of the Ashen crown, not as a relic of tyranny, but as a test of spirit. They described a jarl who chose restraint over ruin, and a seeress who bound fire with wisdom. Some embellished as bards do. They added dragons to the sea and giants to the cliffs. Eric cared little for such flourishes. What mattered was that Skeld endured. The sea no longer held its breath in dread. It moved with steady purpose, tide after tide, and beneath the cliffs the crown slept, no longer hungry, but watchful, waiting only if ever the will of many fractured into the ambition of one.
Thus the legend of Skeld was forged, not in unchecked conquest but in mastery over power itself. The fjord remained harsh, the winters long, the sea unforgiving. Yet within that severity lived balance. Eric Halvarsson would one day pass into memory, as all leaders must. Astrid of the deep grove would fade into story and rune. But the oath they carved beneath stone endured. Fire could warm or destroy. A crown could bind or liberate. In Skeld, they had chosen the harder path. And so the ravens returned to the sky, no longer circling in warning, but gliding as witnesses to a people who had faced flame and refused to be consumed.
Loved this story. Tap that like button and subscribe for your daily dose of storytelling. See you in the next one.